through an example of how the Lacey Act has been used successfully for a plant poaching case here in Washington State, where I am. And then I'm going to apply that to the Venus flytrap, the laws that are already in place for the Venus flytrap, and the ways that I think maybe some people could sort of ask the legislature or improve some of those laws that are out there, maybe tweak them a little bit to really incorporate the Lacey Act and the existing state laws in a way that might be a little more beneficial towards actually protecting the flytraps, as well as some of the practical issues and the hurdles that we may have to overcome to successfully use that method. So, get started. Okay. So first, let's just make sure that everyone's on the same page when I talk about poaching. I threw up a couple of examples of definitions there. There's the Black's Law Dictionary, very, very old 17th century dictionary definition, which is still apparently the legal definition today. As you notice, it only applies to certain fish and game. It doesn't include plants at all. And then we have some very broad legal definitions of poaching. A lot of people use the term taking. That's especially used in context with the Endangered Species Act. That can be a very, very broad definition. On the other hand, it could include things that aren't even intentional in some ways, like trampling plants. If we're talking about animals, like the spotted owl, I'll use as an example. A lot of people still popping in. Taking could include things that are, under the Endangered Species Act, for example, things that aren't necessarily intentional harm, things like interfering with a species' ability to mate and reproduce or to have access to food. Like if you have a nesting couple of spotted owls on your property and you clear out some underbrush that clears away the prey that they eat on, that could be considered taking. So I don't want to talk about things that are quite that broad when I'm talking about poaching either. So just to make sure we're on the same page, when I say poaching, just for this presentation, what I'm talking about is intentional acts, so not unintentional things like the example I just gave, either collecting, actually taking the plant away from where it naturally occurs or killing it, a plant or animal, and without a lawful permission. It's in violation of some kind of law on some level. So why do people poach? This is sort of an underpinning that is especially important for law enforcement, and I think prosecutors and attorneys to understand as to what is driving people to actually poach plants in the first place, because we can't come up with a solution that's going to really help anybody unless we can understand those underlying motivations. And this is something I could go on and on about. Believe me, there's so many side topics and tangents, and I'm going to just really breeze through some of them really quickly, but just understand that they're out there, and there are whole other just hours and hours of conversation we could have about some of these. This is a couple of just throwing out a few examples. Sometimes people just like the thrill of breaking the law. They just like going out there. Some people are, they're out there searching for that perfect trophy, that's very rare species of moss that they just have to have in their collection, something like that. Organized crime is obviously a huge problem. That could be, I'm not going to get a whole lot into that because that is a huge other topic on itself. Just recognize that it is underlying a lot of things. In fact, wildlife and plant trafficking around the world is such a massive problem. I have a little fun statistic for you. This is a very recent estimate. I think this was made in 2019. Legal wildlife and plant trade around the world is about a $200 billion a year illegal scheme. It's only outranked by drug trafficking. And a lot of these big organized crime conglomerates fund their other crime rings through the relatively lower risk wildlife and plant trafficking. You have terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab that fund a lot of what they do through like ivory and lumber poaching and trafficking. It's an enormous, enormous problem. And I really wish we could talk more about it, but I'm just gonna leave it there for now. Culture is another big factor that you have to be considerate of and kind of sensitive to, because sometimes people don't really think of it as poaching. They don't think of it as going out and they're breaking the law. They're going out there because this is what their family has done, or maybe generations. People in, who grew up in the Appalachians, and maybe their families have gone out and dug ginseng for generations back, and this is just part of who they are and what they do. This also can bring up some very complicated issues with tribal law and treaty rights. Here in Washington, for example, we have a lot of treaties that are still somewhat in force, somewhat in effect, depending on who's doing the actual enforcing. And there have been instances where we have some Native tribal members who claim that as part of their treaty rights to sustainably hunt and gather and forage, that they can go out into like federal woods and gather berries, salal, things that are part of their heritage and their culture and part of their recognized treaty rights. Again, not going to get into that because that's a whole other huge topic, but just, have some sensitivity and just be aware that these are factors that can be underlying why someone is going out there and collecting things, and that's something we need to consider if that is the case. Sometimes people just like to be rebellious. They just don't like the government telling them what to do. They, I'm going to do what I want. I certainly, I wasn't an enforcement agent, but just working with Fish and Wildlife, ran across quite a few people with this kind of attitude, regular poachers. So I think we're all probably familiar with people with that kind of attitude. Just, I can do what I want. I'm not really affecting the resource because I'm just one person. And that can be a very difficult mind frame to try to get around. But the real reason that I want to focus on for this, and that I talked a lot more about in my paper, is poverty as a driving factor for poaching. And that's not to say that that excludes any of these other factors. There's often a lot of overlap from person to person. But the reason that I want to talk about poverty is because this is where in the law we can start to address it a little bit more, use our government resources to more efficiently target exactly where these enforcement efforts are going, and try to get around the problem of people who are not going to really be deterred or stop poaching if they're poaching because they're just desperate, they need the money. So, and this could cover a lot of different areas in itself. Sometimes people they just need the food. They're going out there, they're getting whatever fish they can catch. Doesn't matter if it's out of season or if they're closed. They're going out there digging up wild plants, fruits or berries, ginseng, because that's what they need to eat, and maybe they don't have access to food. It could be tied into substance abuse issues. If somebody has a meth addiction, for example, and they just need that quick fix and they're desperate and they're going to grab whatever is available. I'm going to borrow an analogy that one of the prosecutors that I talked to, one of the federal prosecutors, gave this analogy, and I just want to borrow it from him because I think it's a pretty good analogy. If you need some quick money for whatever reason, and whatever environment you're in, you're just going to grab whatever is available and try to sell it. If you're in the city, that could include digging up wires, trying to get the copper, breaking into cars, grabbing change, whatever is on hand. If you're out in a rural area, that could include going out, chopping down valuable trees in the middle of the night, going out in the swamp, digging up flytraps, for example. Anything that you can just grab that's going to be relatively low risk. It's not a violent crime. Usually it's very difficult to catch somebody. And if you can make a few quick bucks out of that, even if you have a very low risk of getting caught, but also if you do get caught, you're maybe going to get a very low fine. That's really not going to be much of a deterrence for somebody if the real driving factor as to why they're going out there in the first place is just because they need some quick money. If they get, it used to be a $50 fine was the maximum for poaching a Venus flytrap if you got caught, and a misdemeanor. But if you could grab a few hundred of them, sell them for 25 cents, maybe $1 a piece, you know, that's not really going to deter a lot of people, especially if there's very low risk of you getting caught in the first place. So this is, you have to figure out a way as to why people poach and how to better target our efforts to get around that issue, to make it better to protect the plants themselves, because we do want to actually deter these crimes. Maybe get those people into other programs that are going to serve them a little better, so they're not going out and committing the same crimes over and over again, and just protecting our ecosystem. And I'm sure I don't have to really argue this to any of you who are here today. I'm probably preaching to the choir, but you know, it's kind of an unusual area of the law. A lot of people don't think about, they might not think about poaching as a real problem in general, and they might especially not think about it in the context of plant poaching. And so you might run into some arguments, some pushback as to like, well, why is this even a big deal? Why do we need to put any effort into doing this? So just kind of a few points to counter argue that. Deterrence, as I said, if you do have some deterrence in the law, it does send a message that, hey, these are resources that are important to us and we're taking them seriously. As I mentioned with the organized crime, it's often tied to other crimes, either on a organized crime level or even on an individual level. If someone's going out there and they're poaching out of poverty, they might also be have some substance issues. They might also be burglaring, other things like that. It allows opportunities, just bringing these people into the criminal justice system, even if as an individual, maybe, sending them to jail isn't going to be the best solution for that individual. It's still, just bringing them into the criminal justice system at all could offer the opportunity to then connect that person to, maybe drug court, mental health treatment court, other support services that might better serve them and kind of get them off their current course. It protects the businesses that do deal fairly, lumber mills, things like that. Here's a big one, I think one that we're all acutely aware of right now. We only need to point to our current pandemic that we're experiencing right now, which can be tied back to some illegal wildlife trafficking of pangolins and bats, as to why preventing these, non-tracked, these underground spread of animals and plants can really be devastating to everybody. Obviously, it protects the plants themselves and the ecosystem that relies on them. And talking about carnivorous plants specifically, because they do consume a lot of insects, and the data behind this is kind of non-existent as far as I could find, or it's a little more anecdotal, it's piecemeal. But I think it's fairly reasonable to expect that removing these plants from the ecosystem also removes some of the effect that they have in consuming these insects and keeping insect populations under control, also prevent the spread of disease from those insects. So just very briefly going to go through what some of the plant laws are. And it kind of went from a top-down approach. Sort of the big overhanging law on the international scale is CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. I'm really not going to get into that. I think some of you out there already deal with this as part of your regular job, or you have a lot of connections working with CITES. It obviously comes in a lot more on the international scale, foreign imports, things like that. Just as a really, really brief overview for those of you who aren't familiar with CITES at all, it kind of works a little similarly to the Endangered Species Act in that you have across the entire global community various lists of plants and animals that are ranked according to how threatened they are, and restrictions on how or even if those plants and animals and products made from them can be traded from country to country, from state to state. And then on the United States federal level, you have the Endangered Species Act and the Lacey Act are the two big federal laws that come into place for plants. You know, there's a bunch of other laws and acts out there as well, but these are kind of the big ones that are more consistently used. I kind of just explained how the Endangered Species Act works for those of you who aren't familiar. Somebody puts in a petition, usually scientists, because they know the most about these species, as to why they think a certain species needs to be listed. The Fish and Wildlife Service, or occasionally NOAA, will review these petitions, decide if a species does warrant being listed as either threatened or endangered, if they're even more threatened. And they can publish critical areas, potentially, as to areas that should be protected to prevent these species that are at imminent risk of extinction. That's kind of the threshold level to get on the Endangered Species Act. And the Lacey Act we're going to talk more about in a bit. And then kind of at the tip of the pyramid, the bottom tip, are various state laws. They're very piecemeal. There's a few out there. There's some state Endangered Species Act, and they're really kind of all over the place. So whatever state you're in, whatever area you're operating in, I would encourage you to look at the state laws that are available, if there are any, and there might not be any for plants, because a lot of people don't maybe pay that much attention to them. And if there aren't any, that would also be a good opportunity and a good place to start going to your legislatures, to your state representatives and senators, and just encouraging them, hey, here's a species that I know about in my state. There aren't any laws here that protect it. And so if something happens to it and it's being, you know, maybe it's highly targeted by collectors, or people take it to make you know, these like pseudoscience medicinal tonics out of it or something, that might be a place to start going to your state legislatures and start advocating for them to pass some laws for those plants. Just really briefly going to talk about why I don't really want to focus on the Endangered Species Act. It doesn't provide as many protections for plants as it does for animals. There's a few points. Those plants have to be on federal land as opposed to an animal. The Endangered Species Act covers animals on private lands, public lands, but plants only if they're on federal lands. It also only protects plants from actual possession or intentional violations of state laws, which can be very, very difficult to prove. We're going to talk more about that. Very difficult to enforce, even for animals, especially so for plants. I mentioned the critical areas part of endangered species before. That can be a very important part of protecting an animal, because if you're setting aside, here's a critical area of habitat for this animal, we have to preserve this habitat because it's critical to this species survival. Sometimes publishing those critical area habitats for a plant is actually just putting a giant red flag out for poachers, collectors, even people who might not intentionally be wanting to harm them, but they just want to see these plants if they're plant enthusiasts, and going out there and basically telling everybody, hey, here's where you can find them. And I threw the rock gnome lichen up there as an example of that, as a species that is on the endangered species list. And Fish and Wildlife Service, when they published that finding, they actually put together a pretty good explanation as to why they didn't publish the critical area for the rock gnome lichen, exactly for that reason. Even well-intentioned collectors, scientists wanting to go out there were just basically demolishing this lichen. So they're kind of secretive, and it's actually very difficult to do, to put a species on the list without publishing a critical area or designating a critical area. You have to really prove why that would be harmful to the species. And it's also very slow and difficult to get on the ESA. There's a petition that was sent in 2016, the end of 2016, for the Venus flytrap, currently still under review. It passed the initial review, I want to say in 2017, maybe the very beginning of 2018. I just checked a few days ago just to make sure that nothing had changed. It is still pending review. So as you can tell, it can take a very long time for something to get listed. And then here's just a few examples. I saw, I think, at least one person out there from Arizona. There's some good saguaro cacti protections out there. Just a few examples of some state laws that are out there. Again, I would just encourage you to see what is available in your area. And here's kind of how the Lacey Act works overall. The Lacey Act has been around. It was passed originally in 1900. It's a very old law. It's been very successful in some ways. It's not used as frequently, I think, as some other laws, but it's probably for a good reason, because when it is used successfully, it can really pack a very big punch. Initially, for a long time, it didn't have a lot of protections for plants, not nearly as many as for animals. In 2008, a lot of that was amended. Congress, as part of their amendments, they said that kind of the two main reasons that they wanted to increase the protections for plants at that point was because, one, they wanted to protect the ecosystem and everything in it, and they were hoping to kind of balance out some of the unfair timber practices of people and other countries illegally importing or even domestically trading and trafficking in illegal lumber that was really harming the legal lumber industry. So there's kind of there's a whole bunch of other things too. It gets a lot more complicated, but there's kind of three overall types of acts that the Lacey Act prohibits as it pertains to plants. One is importing foreign plants improperly. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that. So I'm going to focus domestically. Falsely labeling the plants for either going out to other countries or in between states. And the really big part is just sort of the other category. Any of these activities, selling, receiving, acquiring, purchasing any plants, whether or not it's on an endangered list, anything like that, that's been taken or possessed in violation of any federal, tribal, state, or foreign law. This is huge. I mean, this is a giant legal hook that, as long as there is some state law on point, there's some federal law on point, there's some tribal law on point, if there's just something you can use as a hook to bring it into the Lacey Act, this can provide just such a powerful enforcement punch. And that also includes plants that have been legally harvested, but maybe there was some kind of fee or tax required for transporting them that wasn't paid. So this would also be an opportunity to maybe work with some money laundering enforcement officials. Sometimes that could be the hook to really bring in the Lacey Act. I'm going to give you an example of the case that happened here in Washington involving figured maple. I threw up just some pictures, you can kind of see what figured maple wood looks like. They're just maple trees, but sometimes they grow a little weirdly. They have these really interesting patterns, and they become very valuable making instruments, really cool looking furniture. This is literally just a Google image search I did for figured maple, popped up with just a few examples that I took a screenshot of, but it was just a whole screen full of, you can see there are a lot of Etsy listings, a lot of eBay listings, maybe not the most reputable sources. I mean, who knows where they got some of this wood. Um, Very easy to find. So here's some facts of the case. We have a local lumber mill, J&L Tonewoods, which is owned and operated by just one person. It's a one-person LLC, I believe. And he was buying these big leaf maple that have been cut and taken illegally from the Gifford and Show National Forest. Now the federal prosecutors, they did charge the 3 individual poachers. They referred to them as the maple cutters. They charged them for relatively lesser crimes. I mean, they were charged for crimes for the theft and the damage to government property, actually going into this national forest and cutting down these maples in the middle of the night. But they really put the larger enforcement effort on the company, J&L Tonewoods, and the sole owner for knowingly buying stolen maple. This is where the Lacey Act came in, and I'm going to show you the kind of the layout of the laws they used for that. Somebody like these maple cutters, as they refer to them, could maybe make, if it was a big tree, maybe a very valuable tree, they might be able to make $1,000, maybe a few $1,000s off of a single stolen maple tree. But this company, this one guy, really made over $800,000 in profit from this stolen maple in just 2 years. So you can really see how even just one of these kind of upchain buyers can just make massive profits off of our resources and usually get very little comeuppance for it. And the prosecutor that I talked to for some time, who prosecuted this case, Seth Wilkinson, he was telling me that he was going after these kind of lower end poachers, these guys just going out in the middle of the woods, and, take a little meth. It gives them the energy they need all night to just go out there and just like hand cut down these giant trees, grab some chainsaws, hack them up, chuck them in a pickup truck, take them down to the local mill. And it's still difficult to catch them, but maybe easier to catch those guys. But, they get a small fine, maybe a day or 2 in jail, if that. It wasn't stopping them. They just kept going out and chopping down trees because it was quick and easy money for them. So that's what really motivated him to start going after one of these mills that was buying the wood and really making massive profits off of it. So it was indicted before a grand jury successfully, and after that indictment, it was then settled. So this is kind of, and this might be a little too much legal nitty-gritty for the biologists out there, but I just wanted to lay it out there for any law enforcement or prosecutors out there. This is kind of the hook for how you incorporate the state law. Use it to target one of these upscale buyers, the dealers, and to pack a larger punch, and how you hook it into the Lacey Act. So the state law in this case is the Washington Specialized Forest Products Act. This basically has a list of trees and plants that are considered specialized forest products that the state recognized as needing protection. You need to have a state-issued permit for harvesting those plants, and also at the bottom to hook into the Lacey Act. They also used a violation of federal law, which is just receipt of stolen federal property, since these particular trees happen to be taken out of a national forest where you also need to get permission to take trees out of. but they targeted the dealer because also as part of the Specialized Forest Products Act, the mill owner himself was required to record the permits of every seller that sold him the wood. And he wasn't doing that because obviously those guys didn't have permits because they were stealing the maple wood. And his lack of keeping track of that was kind of the proof of his intention that he knew that wood was stolen and yet he was buying it anyway. And that gave us the hook to go into the Lacey Act, and this I just took directly out of the indictment language actually against J&L Tongwoods. This is how it's worded, that he knowingly engaged in conduct that involved the sale and purchase of plants knowing that they've been taken in violation of state law. So finally getting to the Venus flytrap. I promised you it was coming. Really brief, looks like a lot of you know more than I probably do about the Venus flytrap anyway. It's a truly unique species. It is the only land species of carnivorous plant that has the snap trap. Just in case anyone out there isn't familiar, those little hairs that you can kind of see in its jaw, if they get triggered, say more than two or three of them, the more hairs that are triggered at once by something, an insect or something touching them, it triggers a response where those little jaws rapidly snap shut and close around the insects. There's nothing else like it in the whole world. There really isn't. It's native only to one region of North and South Carolina. It can easily be grown in a lab or in a garden, in a greenhouse. There are a lot of legal cultivators of Venus flytraps who are legally propagating and selling their own flytraps. And we're going to get into kind of how complicated it can be to distinguish if a plant is legally grown, cultivated flytrap versus one that has been illegally taken out of the wild. So there's, as far as collectors go, there's really no reason why they need to go out there and get wild Venus flytraps, because they are fairly easy to grow, but yet they are still hugely threatened by poaching, depending on which study, which survey you look at. Poaching is either the #1 or very, very, very close second threat to the existence of the flytrap in the wild. I already mentioned it's still pending listing as endangered species. It's not just in demand by collectors just because they're really cool, but also if there are some products out there claiming that the flytrap can cure a variety of ailments, which there is absolutely no scientific evidence to suggest that it has any medicinal properties. It might, but there's no evidence, any actual studies, at least none that I can find, to suggest that it has any properties like that. But that doesn't stop people from selling those things. So here, North Carolina actually took a stand in 2014, recognizing the issue and the problem that poaching plays for Venus flytraps. So in 2014, they passed this law, which increased the penalty from a misdemeanor, I think I said earlier, a $50 maximum fine, up to a felony, taking that's the actual language. Oh, you can get jail time, that's 4 to 30 months in prison for each flytrap that's taken. There are also some pre-existing plant conservation laws. Collector's permits has to be in the person's possession. They have to get permission from wherever they take away the Venus flytrap. Kind of similarly to the maple case that I just talked about, this could also be a hook for kind of tracking some of these flytraps and the flow as to where they're getting sold, who's buying them, and how to prove if somebody is knowingly buying or selling stolen flytraps. Give you a few case updates. Even though this passed in 2014, there have been some successful cases already under it. They're very few. One of the problems with it is that the law just taken as itself, you still have to catch somebody in the act of poaching, which usually involves, an enforcement officer is out there looking usually over like a huge area, and they just happen to stumble across somebody, which can be hard enough to see by themselves if they're maybe hidden by some tall grass, they're down on their knees, maybe even crawling on their bellies. They can be good at hiding. And just catching somebody as they're leaving the place or in the act of digging up the fly traps. The cases that have been prosecuted were literally where that happened, where somebody an enforcement officer just happened to stumble across somebody just on their belly digging up fly traps, or they saw the officer and took off running and had like hundreds of fly traps in their backpack, something like that. Once somebody is gone, it can be very, very difficult to prove or even find that person or know about it, other than the evidence of a bunch of holes being left in the ground. And the little graph that I put up here was something I just kind of threw together from some very basic surveys. Roger Shue talked about some surveys that he's been doing in the Green Swamp Preserve. It's probably not really statistically significant. There's only been 12 to 18 plots that he's been watching, and kind of not really enough data to tell if it's having much of a deterrence effect or not. This is 2014, the year that the felony law was passed. There was a pretty significant dip after that. There was a big case of somebody actually getting jail time for being caught with some fly traps. Then it went back up, then it went back down. So, the data is kind of too piecemeal to tell if it's really having much of a deterrence effect or not. This could be, other factors in play. Who was it? There was somebody who said that they've been doing surveys, some status surveys. I think it was Misty Buchanan. So if you have any updates about that at the end, I would be very curious to hear. Here's just a couple of news articles. The one on the left, 2016, was the first person who was actually given a jail sentence for poaching Venus flytraps, Paul Simmons Jr. On the right is another fairly recent case, early 2019. I made this particular news article had a little bit of an error that I corrected. It wasn't 73 counts. It was actually 216 counts of fly traps that he was charged with. I couldn't find out the results of this case, so I know there's some people out in North Carolina there. If you have any updates on that, I couldn't get a hold of anybody as to what actually happened to this guy. But so there's a few cases out there, and as you can see, it's a pretty significant fine, but it's still a little early. We don't have enough cases, and we don't have enough data to tell if this is actually deterring people. So how can we more equitably actually curb the poaching? And I have a few kind of layers. One is the use of tougher penalties, because deterrence is a factor to be considered, as I said. But you got to be careful, because just using that by itself can reinforce the cycle of poverty. If that's the reason why someone is poaching in the first place, it's not really going to stop them. You can't pay a small fine, you can't afford to buy food. Having a larger fine, having jail time isn't going to be any more of a deterrent effect. So you got to layer in some other considerations. Layer two is if we can prove the buyer's criminal intent, prove that the person that these poachers are selling their illegally gotten plants to know that those plants are being taken illegally, then you can bring them in. And these are the people who are making more of the profits. It also gives a better chance to track where these plants are going and offer greater protection for wild populations if we can distinguish between the wild fly traps that are being taken versus the legally cultivated and sold fly traps. And then the third, as necessary, maybe even if you have like a big case, if you have a really egregious case of a buyer just making massive profits, taking in a lot of fly traps, to bring in the Lacey Act, incorporate some of these state laws against the Lacey Act. I mean, they're the ones making the profits. They're the ones having a much bigger effect on the market. They should be the ones taking a heavier burden of the crime. It should fall on them more than the people who are maybe making a couple $100, getting a few days or even a few months in jail, and then going back out there and just doing it all over again. So using the same sort of format that I used to break down the Maple case, you can bring in the North Carolina state law, the felony poaching law that I had up earlier. Poacher digs up and they carry away a fly trap from a state park or a federal park or wherever they didn't have permission to dig up that plant. And then if you can use, and these are a couple of examples of the currently existing permitting laws for fly traps. The poacher themselves was required to have a permit. Obviously, they're not going to have a permit. You can use that to show intention. And if the dealer buys a fly trap, they have currently, they have certain buying seasons, and they have to get a copy of that poacher's permit, well, of their seller's permit, which obviously they're not going to have if that person is a poacher. And so it's a very similar structure actually to what happened in the Maple case in Washington. And depending on how strong your evidence is and how much you could prove against that buyer, you could hook in the Lacey Act, either a civil penalty, they didn't use due care to show or to make sure that the fly traps they were buying weren't illegally taken. Could be a criminal misdemeanor if they actually engage in selling and buying and didn't use due care to do that. Or even a felony level if you can prove enough that the buyer actually knew that they were buying illegally taken fly traps. So as far as I know, this has not actually been used yet. This is sort of my outline for how I think the Lacey Act could be used more effectively. But there are maybe some issues that could make this method stronger, or to tighten it up a little bit, make it a little easier to prove on the, proving the actual criminal case. It can be very difficult to show that someone had the intent to commit the crime. And some of these things can strengthen that up. And one thing that I would suggest and maybe throw out there to the state legislature of North Carolina is to require the buyers not just to check that their sellers had a permit, but to maintain records of their permit. Therefore, if they fail to maintain the records of their permits because they're buying illegally taken, they're buying poached fly traps, they're not going to have a record of the permit. That would be a way to prove that they knew those plants were taken illegally. But also add, and there's already in North Carolina laws, buyers and sellers of ginseng have to get and maintain their own permits. It would really take very, very minor alteration to the law to just add Venus flytraps to those who are required to have their permits. And this is where I think the scientific community can really come in and give us some input, maybe some biological marking system to track that, these fly traps taken from maybe this nature preserve actually came from that preserve. And, they're not legally grown, they weren't cultivated somewhere, but they were taken. And that would be a way to prove both that they came from a place where they didn't have permission to be, but also perhaps prove that the buyers taking those fly traps knew that they were illegally taken plants. And I just threw up a couple of examples of things that have been used in the past successfully or could potentially be used. In some ginseng roots, are marked with fluorescent dye in the, I'm forgetting where it was. But anyway, some of the preserves where ginseng are being tracked and protected, they're marked with a kind of orange or a fluorescent dye that shows up under a UV light, so you can tell that, you know, these were wild ginseng that were taken from this particular location. In the maple case that I talked about, the prosecutors actually had DNA samples taken, ready to present. They didn't end up needing to use it because they settled the case out. But that matched the DNA from the lumber that was sold to the mill with the stumps that were left behind. That would be probably a little more difficult for the flytrap as an example. But some sort of DNA marker could potentially be used for some other plants, some other situations. Of course, that would be very expensive and probably difficult to do, but if you had a really big enough case, like a really egregious case, it might be worth doing. And I couldn't find a lot of validation of this, but I saw some reports that in the Green Swamp Preserve, they have been using some kind of orange dye to mark their fly traps. I don't know how accurate that report was. Like I said, I couldn't find a lot of validation. So this is where I would like to hear a lot of more input from the biologists out there and the botanists out there as to ways of kind of tracking where these plants are moving through the system, because that can lend a lot stronger evidence to proving if something is being poached and where it's being sold, and maybe even track it up to some of the bigger buyers and distributors that are driving more of this black market chain. So here's just a few extra sources, some updated sources. Some of these I didn't even use, but I just came across them as I was researching some interesting papers in case you're really bored and you just want to have something more to read. So there you go. You thought I could make it through an entire presentation on Venus flytraps without making a reference to the Little Shop of Horrors, but I couldn't. So here's where I'd like to open it up for some more input and questions if anybody has any.
Thank you, Katrina. That was great. Yeah, so let's go ahead and see if some folks would like to ask questions. And Anne, did you say you can see when people are raising their hand?
Yeah, I should be able to. And
Okay.
I think folks can unmute themselves, but if everybody or several people unmute at once, it might be a little chaotic. So yeah, either send me a chat or raise your hand.
Okay, yeah, let's open it up to questions. Are there any questions out there?
Yeah, I have a question here. By not prosecuting, doesn't this create contempt for the law? I absolutely agree. Yeah, Johnny Randall, that's your question, right, in the chat? 100% agree.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. You had another?
Yeah, no, that one's, I have a second question, but yes, please answer the first one.
Okay. Yeah, I 100% agree. I think these crimes, this might be my personal opinion, I think these crimes are very much under prosecuted. I think they need to be prosecuted more. I think there needs to be more of a recognition for why it is important to bring these people into the criminal justice system and enforce these laws. Otherwise, they're not going to have any deterrence effect. No one's going to take them seriously, and they're not going to really protect anything. So, yeah, absolutely.
So my other question is, it has been suggested that if Venus flytrap is federally listed as threatened or endangered, that it will drive the legitimate trade, especially the international trade in flytraps, underground, and that will possibly increase, lose control of the trade, the legitimate trade. And because that would, if it's listed, then if you ship internationally, you have to go through all this very restrictive permitting. And so what do you think about that?
That is a good question. There are exceptions in the Endangered Species Act for scientific purposes, for legitimate purposes. It usually doesn't apply to cultivated plants. So, I mean, I'm trying to think if, if it were implemented, if it might actually have an effect. I mean, it would require a more permitting. It would, make shipping overseas maybe a little more difficult. But if anything, it seems like it would make it easier for those who are doing legitimate business to prove that they are doing legitimate business, because it would make it a lot harder for those who are, incorporating poached fly traps. Maybe they have a mix of cultivated and poached fly traps in what they're selling. Make it harder for them to prove that those non-cultivated fly traps were actually cultivated. So I don't think that's a good reason to not list it, honestly. And I threw out some criticisms there, but I'm not saying that the Endangered Species Act or that listing it as an endangered species would be a bad thing. It would offer some more protections. It would especially protect those that are already on federal lands, and also provide much more powerful enforcement mechanism through the Endangered Species Act itself. So I don't think it would be a bad thing for it to be listed. I just don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So we had a question from Leah Oliver. Leah, do you want to unmute yourself? Came in through the chat as well.
Yes, hi. Thank you for your talks. It's very interesting. So in our work at NatureServe, we've reviewed a lot of species that have these issues about being poached, and we looked at ginseng recently, along with United Plant Savers and Fish and Wildlife Service and so forth. And one of the things that we've noticed is even when there are cases that get prosecuted, the restitution funds don't seem to make their way back to the conservation of the species. And I think my question is, how is it that conservation scientists and the people who understand the impacts that poaching has on the species connect with, law enforcement and other legal institutions? There's a gap, and I guess I'm wondering what you think about how we should connect.
That's a very good question. I'm not sure how well I'd even be able to answer that because it's such a huge area. I mean, for one thing, yeah, and I think the problem of funds that come from a specific thing that go into a general fund and don't really get filtered back to a particular, species or fishery or plant or whatever that really needs that money is, that's kind of a general overall problem, I think, in a lot of states. We certainly have a problem in Washington state where all fish and wildlife funds go into a general fund that might not even go back into fish and wildlife at all, much less into a particular, fishery or wildlife or plant restoration. Some of that I think you could address through bringing up these issues with state legislatures, because sometimes they're the ones controlling where the funding is going. Bringing it up to the heads of these various state agencies or maybe federal agencies as to, this is the need that we see, this is the funding that we need, the funding isn't getting funneled to us, how can we make this happen? And yeah, I don't know how would be the best way to connect to some of the law enforcement officers and the agencies, but maybe just reaching out to, you see a case, you see, and all of this is publicly available information, so you should be able to find it fairly easily, like who was the prosecutor on the case. They could connect you with the law enforcement officers, just opening up more of this dialogue as to what is needed where the funding should go, where you think it should go, you know, trying to get people to send money to the right place is a big problem that I don't know that I have the solution for, but at least, yeah, reaching out to, I would reach out to the individual prosecutors on these cases. Like I said, you can find them, you usually don't even need to do, and from state to state might be different, you don't usually even need to do a public records request. Just go to the court records and see who's listed as the prosecutor, get in touch with those that person, and just tell them your issue, and or where you think the funding should go, and if they have any other connections, and just kind of keep like a round table of contacts, I think would be useful so that everybody is on the same page. I don't know if that was a very satisfying answer, but I think that's the best I can offer.
Thank you.
This is Patricia. I'll just add that I've actually seen in some judgments where it's part of the judgment where the funding will go. And another thing, I can't remember off the top of my head what the case was in particular. I'm sure I should know, but in one case, money actually went to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to then be redistributed via grants to help with the conservation of the species. Maybe somebody else on the line knows of that one and remembers what the species was.
Yeah, that's a good point though. That can be, if you're able to get in touch with like the prosecutor, or maybe be able to give a statement before the judgment is handed down, you could influence and convince the judge that certain funds do need to be earmarked for specific things, and this is why it's important for them to be earmarked. Yeah, so if you can get in touch with some of the the legal community before a judgment happens, while a case is still going through, you could have some input that way. And it just depends on how how willing the judge is to listen to that, but some of them are maybe willing to listen to some more scientific information and yeah, take that into account. That's a good point.
This is Anne. Leah, I unmuted you because I was wondering if you wanted to speak about that particular ginseng case, but I
Yeah, so that was, there was restitution funds that went to the National Wildlife, I'm going to get NIFWIF, and they had funds that were then put into grants, and they oversee how that grant money got distributed, and it was distributed to, this was part of Operation, what is it called? Native Root. And so there was this huge bust in Illinois and, oh golly, Indiana. I'm sorry, I'm just flaking out on remembering the details. Anyways, so for a variety of reasons, the states couldn't accept the funding, so they rounded the funding to NatureServe, and we were able to use it to do some on-the-ground research, field work essentially in those two states, and then had that field work result in presentation in a paper that came out of a symposium in 2017 on ginseng, and also we were able to store all of the DNA samples and for later genetic processing. So that happened to be just sort of one case that we were able to take advantage of, but I did ask these questions of a couple of our partners if there was a practical way of connecting the dots between the cases and conservation scientists either on the ground or folks like NatureServe. And it's essentially what you were mentioning, is it's a convoluted and time-consuming yeah, kind of time consuming issue to do. I think Dale Suter's question might, it's similar, but may have a easier answer.
Yeah, I think I saw Dale Suter's question too. For those of you who can't see, he asked, in a lot of cases, you don't know who the poachers are selling the plants to. So how do we get this information where they're actually selling these plants to? Obviously, that's a big practical issue for really any kind of poaching. This is where, and I think the biology part can come in too, because if there is a way to track plants that are taken from a particular location, that would give a better way of tracking, like, hey, these plants ended up on so-and-so's website that they're selling, but they have this, dye on them or whatever it actually is. That would be one way to kind of track them on a kind of a more simple day-to-day level. It's kind of just depends on who the enforcement officer is and their interrogation techniques and whether they're able to just convince that person, the poacher, to give up the person or the entity that they are selling to. Offering deals can be certainly a way to do that on the prosecutor's side. If you think this person is connected to, maybe a seller or even multiple sellers or buyers, I should say, you could offer, I think this would be a matter of prosecutorial discretion and something for prosecutors to keep in mind. Is it better to go after this one individual person? And maybe if there's somebody who causes a lot of damage in and of themselves, it might be, or is it better to use them as information, maybe offer them deals to try to get them to give up who their who their buyers are, because that would be a much more effective case. So and I would encourage you, if you do know the prosecutors, to maybe talk to them about that. It's going to be kind of up to that individual, but if you are consistently having problems with that, I would just reach out to the prosecutors and make them aware of that and be like, hey, have you thought about maybe building a bigger case against the people who are buying it and using whatever resources you have to offer the sellers deals so that they'll give up those buyers. Very similar to drug, like a drug trafficking ring, really.
It's after 3:30, and so I'll just double check whether there were any more questions in the chat. I don't think so.
I don't see any.
Okay, and I'll just say that definitely environmental crimes, time and time again, you hear about the fact that first you have to convince everyone along the chain that this is an issue, starting with, whether it's the local citizenry, your own boss, prosecutors, judges. So it's definitely something that is a commonality between, sort of crimes against plants and no matter what the species is or where it is. And I think some states have more experience with that than others. And so looking to those states where there have already been successful prosecutions or there are successes in place for trying to, deter poaching or to try to address the issues that lead to poaching is a really good way to at least, you're not starting from nothing, right? You're starting from the base of knowledge of what's already been tried and how that's worked. I do see one final question on why is it called poaching and not stealing?
Yeah.
Would you like to address that, Katrina?
Sure. I'll address that question too. I kind of wanted to piggyback off of what you just said too, Patricia, because it just reminded me, and I think this is where the scientific community can be a more active participant in the law enforcement side of it too, is through just education, because there are a lot of people, even in law enforcement, I mean, even in like fish and wildlife enforcement sometimes, or in, and certainly in the the legal side of things, judges and prosecutors and defense attorneys too, who just don't really know about the problems. They're not aware of them. It's not something that comes up very often or is something people really talk about or think about all that much, especially as it pertains to plants. You know, I've been hugely interested in environmental crimes for a very long time, and it wasn't until 2014 when I, first heard about the Venus flytrap, felony law that I even realized there was this whole realm out there. So maybe hosting educational kinds of seminars or very basic training that are targeted towards local law enforcement, make it maybe less scientifically scary to those who aren't don't have a background in science or maybe a little intimidated by the heavy science part of it, and just focus some training on local law enforcement and prosecutors and defense attorneys in the area, just to make them aware that this is an issue and why it is such an issue. That might be helpful. As to why it's called poaching and not stealing, just a linguistic thing. I mean, it is stealing. It sometimes, there's a bunch of terms out there. Tree theft is commonly used instead of tree poaching. Poaching is just a really, really old term that used to apply to taking animals, game animals, sometimes fish out of like the king's land or a lord's land, somebody that owned the land, and it's just kind of been used throughout time to refer to taking at first animals illegally, and then it's kind of been broadened a little bit to include plants and other natural resources. So it's just a linguistic thing, but it's the same as stealing. It's just specifically towards like taking a living thing.
Well, thank you, Katrina, so much for that really informative and thought-provoking presentation. I'm so grateful that we were able to get you to engage you this month to be our speaker. It's wonderful to hear about the work that you did, and appreciate all the ideas that you have for or the idea that you have for understanding the basis, so that you understand how to address the issue, and then also not just picking on the little guy, the digger or the harvester, who may or may not be the biggest part of the problem. And so I just will say that we will post your presentation to our website. So for folks who are interested in seeing that again, and I think it usually takes us about a week or two. And I hope that you, and if you can, will stay on for our last 20 minutes to just share what we call the Native Plants Roundtable, where we just share information on meetings or activities that are going on across the country and various venues.
Questions or comments, or just want to connect, my email is on the front slide again. Email me anytime you want. I could maybe connect you with some of the sources and people that I have come across researching this for so many years too. So I'm more than happy to connect people as well.
Thank you.